At 73, Miriam Foss opened her mailbox and pulled out a 30-day eviction notice. 30 days to leave the house she'd lived in for 2 decades. She stood on that sidewalk afterward. 2 suitcases, no destination, no plan. The man who'd signed that notice drove past her on his way out. He laughed, actually laughed, convinced she'd do what women her age were supposed to do: shrink, disappear, dissolve into silence where nobody would have to think about her again. What he could not have known, what no one in that small Missouri town could have fathomed, was that the rusted shed Miriam would buy for $5 on the edge of town, the one her own children pleaded with her not to waste a cent on, the one the county had nearly condemned twice, held something behind its corroded walls that would stun an entire community and bring that man to his knees. What Miriam discovered inside that shed didn't simply alter the course of her life. It built something from absolute nothing and proved, permanently, irrevocably, that you should never underestimate a woman standing at the edge of everything with nothing left to lose. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story reaches something inside you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow there's something you won't want to miss. Miriam Foss had spent her whole life being the kind of woman people called dependable. Not radiant, not driven in the ways the world tends to celebrate, just dependable, steady as rainfall. The person who arrived without fanfare, handled whatever needed handling, and made certain everyone around her was comfortable, even when she herself was not. She'd grown up in Hannibal, Missouri, youngest daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who stood behind the counter of the family hardware store for 30 years. Her childhood was modest but whole, the kind that teaches you 2 things early. Hard work has no substitute, and your own needs come last. She carried both lessons forward for the rest of her days. Sometimes they served her, sometimes they hollowed her out. She married Edgar Foss at 24, a quiet, broad-shouldered electrician who loved her with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to every wire he ever ran. Together they built a small life in Clover Falls, a rented house on Meridian Road filled with furniture from estate sales, a vegetable garden stretching out back, 2 children who grew into decent adults and then drifted toward their own distant lives. Edgar died 11 years ago, a stroke on a Wednesday morning. So sudden, so absolute, that Miriam didn't fully believe it until after the funeral, when the house fell silent for the first time in decades. That silence nearly swallowed her. She survived his death the only way she knew how. She kept moving. She tended her garden. She paid rent faithfully every month from her Social Security check and the modest savings Edgar had left behind. She visited neighbors, attended church, settled into a widowhood that was quiet but not bitter. She wasn't a woman who demanded much from the world. She had what she needed, or so she believed. The house on Meridian Road had been rented from the same family for 18 years. The original landlord, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Gentry, was the kind of man who still believed a handshake carried weight. He fixed what broke. He gave fair warning before raising the rent. He'd known Edgar. He treated Miriam with a quiet, unspoken respect, and she had trusted him completely without ever needing to name it. She assumed, without quite forming the thought into words, that she would simply grow old in that house, that it was hers in every way that mattered. Harold Gentry died on a Sunday in March. By Friday, Miriam had met his nephew. Conrad Whitley was 43. Sharp suit, cold arithmetic behind his eyes. He'd inherited 3 rental properties in Clover Falls, along with a philosophy toward tenants that bore no resemblance to his uncle's. Conrad believed in market rate adjustments, maximum returns. He believed above all else that sentiment had no place in real estate, and that an elderly widow paying below market rent in a house he could gut, renovate, and flip for serious profit was not a loyal tenant worth protecting. She was, in his calculation, an obstacle. He left the eviction notice in her mailbox on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Didn't ring the bell, didn't knock, just slid the envelope through and drove away. 30 days. The language inside was legal and bloodless, designed to make cruelty feel like paperwork. Miriam sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading it. The same table Edgar had dragged home from a neighbor's garage sale 2 decades earlier. The table where her children had scratched through math problems, where she had written every check, lifted every morning cup of coffee, marked every unremarkable day of a life she had loved without ever needing to say so. She called Nathan first. Her son in Tulsa was sympathetic in the rushed manner of a man already measuring the disruption to his own routine. He mentioned the spare room in his house, mentioned it the way people mention things they hope will be declined. She called Sylvia in Cincinnati next. Her daughter carried more warmth, more genuine worry in her voice, but she was also hours away, no room to spare. Sylvia offered money, a small amount, enough for a deposit on something new. She offered it with love, but also with the particular helplessness of a person who cannot think of what else to give. Miriam thanked them both, told them she would figure something out. She was 73 years old. She had no interest in becoming anyone's burden, and she was absolutely not finished yet. The 30 days moved faster than she expected. The first week passed in a kind of suspended disbelief. She walked through her daily routine as though the notice in her mailbox had been some clerical mistake that would correct itself if she simply held still. She watered her plants. She baked a loaf of bread. She sat in Edgar's old armchair beside the window and watched November light bleed out of the afternoons, and told herself there was still time to think. By the second week, she understood there was not. The rental market in Clover Falls bore no resemblance to what it had been when she and Edgar first settled on Meridian Road. The town had shifted in the quiet, incremental way small Midwestern towns sometimes do. A handful of new businesses along the main strip, a couple of subdivisions carved from what used to be farmland, property values climbing in ways that rewarded owners and crushed everyone else. What Miriam had paid Harold Gentry each month, she now understood, was a number that belonged to a different era entirely. The current listings she pulled up on the library computer ran nearly double that figure. Most demanded first and last month's deposit, plus a credit check she was not remotely confident she could pass. She visited 4 apartments during the 3rd week. The first sat on the 2nd floor of a building near the highway. Broken elevator. A landlord who kept calling her quote, _0 in a tone that carried no warmth. The second was available immediately because the previous tenant had departed in what appeared to be considerable haste. The smell and the condition of the walls told that story clearly enough. The third was clean and manageable, but required 6 months up front. That commitment would have swallowed nearly everything she had saved. The fourth was above a bar, not available until February, which the landlord explained, with genuine helpfulness, was technically only 3 months away. None of them were possible. Miriam told no one this. She drove home after each viewing and made herself a cup of tea and sat with the particular loneliness of a person running the numbers and finding that the numbers will not bend. It was Pete Salazar at the county assessor's office who mentioned the shed, almost as an afterthought. Miriam had gone in to ask about temporary housing assistance programs. That conversation lasted just long enough to confirm such programs existed, and just long enough to establish that the wait list stretched months, not weeks. Pete had worked the front desk for 22 years. He had developed a quiet gift for reading the specific kind of exhaustion worn by people who walked in hoping for help and walked out without it. He paused as Miriam reached for her coat. "There's a parcel out on Rutter Road," he said. "County's had it listed for a while. Old storage structure on a quarter-acre lot. Hasn't sold. I don't think anyone's even asked. Miriam asked how much. Pete glanced at his screen. $5, he said. Technically just to transfer the deed. Taxes were delinquent for years. County wants it off the books. She asked what was wrong with it. Pete went quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man choosing honesty over comfort. It's a shed, he said carefully. Been sitting empty a long time. I wouldn't get your hopes up about the condition. Miriam Foss had not had her hopes up about anything in several weeks. Miriam asked for the address. Rutter Road ran east out of town, past the grain co-op and the old drive-in theatre. A field of weeds now, and had been for longer than most people could recall. The quarter-acre lot sat at the end of a gravel track, barely visible from the road, marked by a rusted county stake and a no-dumping sign that had clearly been disregarded at some point, and not long ago. Miriam parked and walked toward what she saw, and something settled in her chest. Not hope exactly, more like the quiet absence of surprise. The shed was roughly 20 feet by 14, metal-sided, its original color buried beneath layers of rust and oxidation that had turned the entire exterior a deep reddish brown. The roof was corrugated steel, bowed slightly on one end but holding. A single small window on the south-facing wall had been covered from inside with what looked like cardboard. The door was padlocked. That detail struck Miriam as almost funny, as though anything inside were worth forcing a way in for. She stood in the grey November air and looked at it for a long time. Conrad Whitley had laughed when he handed her the eviction notice. Her son had offered a spare room in the tone of a man already bracing for impact. Her daughter had sent money with the helpless generosity of someone who simply did not know what else to do. And here, at the end of a gravel track past a field of dead weeds, was the only option left that asked nothing of anyone and cost exactly $5. She called Pete at the assessor's office from where she stood on that gravel. She said. He was quiet for a moment. Miriam said. She drove to the county office the next morning and signed the transfer deed. The clerk processed it without ceremony, stamped it twice, and handed it back across the counter. Miriam drove home and finished packing the last of her belongings into her car and her daughter's old minivan. Sylvia had driven up from Cincinnati to help. On the final morning of her 30 days on Meridian Road, Miriam closed the door of the only home she had known as a widow and drove east on Rutter Road without once looking back. She had $5 in the transaction record. She had a padlock key from the county. She had a quarter-acre of Missouri dirt and a rusted shed that no one had wanted for years. She had no idea yet what else she had. The padlock key was small and brass-colored, worn smooth on the bow from years of handling by whoever had last cared about what was inside. Miriam stood in front of the shed door that first morning, her car parked behind her, cold December air moving through the dead grass of the lot, and she held the key for a moment before using it. She was not a superstitious woman. She did not believe in signs or omens or the kind of heavy meaning people tend to press onto ordinary objects in hard moments. She was practical. Her family had been practical. She knew perfectly well that a key was just a key. She turned it anyway, deliberately, as though the act required her full attention. The padlock released. The door swung outward on hinges that screamed with rust. The smell that came out to meet her was layered and complicated. Old wood, cold earth, the particular staleness of air that has sat undisturbed for a very long time. And beneath all of that, something else. Something she could not immediately name. Almost dry, almost papery, like the inside of an old book. She stepped in. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the open door behind her and a pale strip of December sky showing through a gap where the roof met the south wall. She stood still and let her eyes adjust. The floor was wood planking, old, visibly soft in places, covered in a thin layer of grit and what looked like decades of accumulated dust and debris. The interior walls were bare metal sheeting, streaked with oxidation. Along the eastern wall, several wooden shelves stood empty, except for a few rusted coffee tins and a coil of wire so corroded it had fused into a single solid shape. In the far corner stood a wooden workbench, its legs uneven, one end shimmed with a folded scrap of tin. This was not a home. It barely qualified as storage. Cold seeped from every surface. Dimness pooled in the corners. The air carried the weight of years, of neglect, of that particular sorrow that clings to things left behind without a word of farewell. Miriam Foss stood in the centre of it all and gave a single nod. The kind of nod a person offers when reality simply confirms what the body already knew. Then she walked back to the car and retrieved her cleaning supplies. Those first 3 days belonged to function, not feeling. She swept, she scrubbed, she pried the cardboard from the small window and allowed pale winter light to press through filthy glass. She sealed the gap along the roofline with a tube of weatherproof cork purchased from the hardware store in town. She assembled the small camping cot she'd brought, positioned it well clear of the soft patches in the floor, and arranged her essentials with the deliberate efficiency of a woman who had chosen survival over comfort. She did not cry. The crying was already behind her. What lived in its place was a kind of sharpened anger, something she had spent the past month learning to treat as fuel. It was the 4th day. She was prying up a section of rotted floor planking near the workbench, boards that had begun to bow dangerously underfoot, when she found it. The crowbar caught a plank edge and lifted it cleanly. Beneath was not the bare Missouri earth she expected. Beneath was a seam, a deliberate seam, cut in a rectangle roughly 4 feet by 3, with a recessed iron ring set flush into the wood on one side. A trap door. Miriam settled back on her heels and stared. She was not an impulsive woman. She considered things before acting. She weighed the structural integrity of whatever waited below, the likelihood of animals nesting down there, the practical question of what purpose a hidden underground chamber could possibly serve in her current situation. She considered all of this for roughly 45 seconds. Then she gripped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it appeared, swollen with old moisture but not sealed. It resisted. Then it gave all at once, releasing a stronger wave of that dry, papery scent she had noticed on the first morning. Richer now, almost sweet. Below lay a root cellar, perhaps 5 feet deep, roughly matching the trapdoor's footprint, with packed earth walls that had been lined at some point with fitted wooden boards. Dry, remarkably dry, given everything above. And stacked inside, wrapped in what looked like muslin cloth tied with cotton cord, bundle upon bundle, rising from the earthen floor to just below the trapdoor frame. Shapes Miriam recognized even through their wrappings. Quilts, dozens of them, carefully, deliberately stored, preserved as though someone had placed them there with great intention and with every expectation of coming back. Miriam reached down and lifted the nearest bundle. Even through the fabric wrapping, she felt the weight, the density of the stitching. Her hands, steady all week through every task she demanded of them, began to tremble, very slightly. She did not yet understand what she held, but something deeper than thought, some instinct older than reason, recognized it. She was holding something that mattered. She carried the bundles up one by one, setting each on the workbench in the thin December light filtering through the cleaned window. 31 of them. She counted twice to be certain. Each wrapped in muslin cloth, aged to the color of old cream, tied with cotton cord that had dried and stiffened but refused to rot. Whoever had packed these had done it properly. Whoever had packed these had meant for them to endure. She opened the nearest bundle first, worked the cord loose with careful fingers, pulled back the muslin layer by layer until the quilt inside lay exposed. She spread it across the workbench as far as the space allowed, stepped back, and looked. It stopped her breath. The quilt was large, perhaps full bed-sized, worked in a pattern she recognized faintly from her mother's descriptions of old craft traditions. A complex medallion design radiating outward from a central octagonal block, pieced from dozens of distinct fabric squares in deep indigo, rust, gold and cream. The stitching was remarkably fine, small, uniform, speaking of mastery and a patience that bordered on the inhuman. The fabrics had aged, but held together, not fragile, not surrendering. Color had softened across the decades, but refused to collapse into nothing. The whole piece carried weight, a density of purpose that transformed the dim metal shed into something almost sacred. Miriam had grown up surrounded by quilts. Her mother made them, her grandmother made them. She understood the craft well enough to distinguish between something stitched for warmth and something stitched with an entirely different order of devotion. What lay on the workbench belonged to that second category. Maybe, she thought, to a category beyond even that. She opened a second bundle, another quilt, equally stunning, a double wedding ring pattern rendered in colors that had no business surviving decades underground as well as they had. A third bundle revealed a log cabin design so precisely executed that the geometry seemed to pulse with its own quiet energy. A fourth held a cathedral windows pattern, each tiny folded window piece joined with a precision that would have demanded a magnifying glass and a degree of commitment Miriam could barely fathom. She sat on her camping cot in the center of the shed. Opened bundles surrounded her on every side. She looked at what she had uncovered and tried to force her mind into something resembling clarity. The obvious question, who made them? The second question, why someone had hidden them here. The third question crept in slower, surfacing gradually as her hands moved across each one. What might they actually be worth? Miriam was not naive about antique textiles. She had watched enough of those television programs, the appraisers, the estate sale revelations, to understand that handmade quilts of genuine age and exceptional quality could command serious prices, particularly in certain markets, particularly when accompanied by any trace of provenance. But she also knew she was no expert. What she believed she was seeing and what was actually spread across that cot might be two entirely different things. She needed information. She needed someone who understood what she did not. The nearest town with a library carrying reference materials on American folk art and textile history sat 40 minutes away. Miriam drove there the following morning. The librarian, a precise woman named Cecile, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and had clearly fielded unusual research requests before, helped Miriam locate 3 reference volumes on American quilt history. She directed her to an online database of documented antique textile sales. Miriam sat at the library table for 4 hours. She took careful notes in the small spiral notebook she had carried in her purse for years. What she learned rearranged everything. The patterns she had found, the medallion, the double wedding ring, the log cabin, the cathedral windows, were consistent with documented styles from the mid to late 19th century. The fabric compositions she could assess by touch and close examination suggested pre-industrial weaving. The stitching density in several of the quilts matched what reference texts described as the work of accomplished makers in the Missouri and Kentucky quilting traditions. Women whose pieces had, in documented cases, sold at major auction houses for figures that made Miriam's hand press harder on the notebook page. Pause. Press down. A single authenticated 19th century Missouri quilt of significant quality had sold at a St. Louis estate auction 3 years earlier for $4,000. A collection of documented works by a known maker had gone for 11 times that amount. Miriam had 31 quilts in a root cellar on Rutter Road. She sat in the library parking lot afterward, did not start the car for a long time. The winter afternoon hung grey and cold around her. Bare trees along the street bent in a wind she could see through the glass, but not hear. She thought about Conrad Whitley's eviction notice sitting in the mailbox. She thought about Nathan's spare room, offered in the tone of inconvenience. She thought about the county clerk stamping the transfer deed twice without glancing up. $5. She had paid $5 for this. She turned the key, pulled out toward Rutter Road, and for the first time in months, she was smiling. The first person Miriam called was Cecile. Not the obvious choice. Cecile was a librarian. Miriam had met her exactly once. 4 hours spent hunched over reference books, sharing a pot of terrible coffee from the machine by the periodical section. She was not a friend, not yet. But she was the only person Miriam had encountered in recent weeks who had offered help without hesitation. And without that particular look. The one people give a 73-year-old woman on her own. That careful, slightly pitying expression. The one where you can almost watch them doing the math in their heads, calculating how much of a burden she might become. Cecile hadn't looked at her that way. Cecile had looked at her research request the way a person looks at a puzzle worth solving, with energy, not reluctance. Miriam picked up the phone, called the library, asked for Cecile by name. She explained as plainly as she could manage what she had discovered and what she needed. She needed to learn how to authenticate antique quilts. She needed to understand the formal assessment process. She needed to know whether what she held in her hands was genuinely significant, or whether she'd spent 4 hours in a library constructing a tower of hope on a foundation made entirely of wishful thinking. Cecile went quiet for a moment after Miriam finished speaking. Then she said, quote 11, that someone was Dr. Anita Voss, a textile historian at the University of Missouri who had devoted 30 years to documenting American folk art traditions. She drove down to Clover Falls on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, her car packed with reference binders and a magnifying loop she wore around her neck like a pendant. She was in her 60s, brisk and warm in equal measure. She walked into the shed on Rutter Road, by then considerably cleaner, considerably more organized. Miriam had spent the intervening weeks making it as presentable as a rusted metal structure on a gravel lot could reasonably become. Dr. Voss stepped in front of the first quilt Miriam had spread across the workbench and said nothing, for almost 2 full minutes. Then, quote 12. It was not a question, it was the sound of someone recalibrating everything she thought she knew. Miriam told her the whole story. The eviction, the $5 deed, the padlock key, the trapdoor hidden beneath the rotted floor. Dr. Voss listened without interrupting, her magnifying loop already travelling slowly across the surface stitching of the medallion quilt. When Miriam finished, Dr. Voss looked up with an expression that was carefully professional, but unable to fully conceal what churned beneath it. __quote _13______. She said. She moved to the second bundle. Miriam nodded. Dr. Voss opened 4 more quilts over the next hour. She examined each with the loop and with her bare hands, turned edges, studied backing seams, held sections up to the light that fell through the window. She photographed everything, made notes in a small leather journal. She spoke little while she worked, and Miriam, who had learned long ago when to let silence do its job, did not fill it. When she finished, Dr. Voss lowered herself into the folding chair Miriam had placed beside the workbench, removed the loop from around her neck, looked at Miriam directly. She said. She paused. Miriam asked the question she had carried for 3 weeks, the one she'd held between her ribs like a breath she was afraid to release. What does exceptional mean, in practical terms? Dr. Voss offered the number carefully. The way you hand someone something that might shatter. Individual pieces in this condition, at this level of craftsmanship, she said, authenticated and accompanied by any provenance documentation, they would draw serious collector interest. A collection this size, this cohesive, with provenance established, could attract institutional attention. Museums, university collections, historical foundations. She offered a range of figures. The low end froze Miriam's hands in her lap. The high end transformed the shed into a place she no longer recognized. After Dr. Voss left, Miriam sat alone for a long time. Winter light was draining from the windows. Wind moved through dead grass on the lot, a dry whisper with no audience. She thought about the woman who had made these quilts, whoever she was, bent over fabric in the lamplight of some vanished Missouri farmhouse, stitching without any knowledge that 150 years later, a 73-year-old widow would pull her life's work from the earth and be rescued by it. Miriam held that woman in her mind for a very long time. Then she reached for her notebook and started making a plan. The authentication process consumed 4 months. Dr. Voss connected Miriam with Raymond Chu, a certified textile appraiser based in Kansas City. He drove out to Rutter Road in February with an assistant, and the two of them spent an entire day photographing, cataloguing, and scrutinizing each of the 31 quilts. The thoroughness was both reassuring and faintly unnerving. The way any careful process becomes unnerving when the outcome matters too much for anyone to be casual about it. Raymond spoke little during the examination itself. He communicated mostly through sound, small involuntary murmurs of appreciation he seemed not entirely aware he was producing. 3 weeks later, he called with his preliminary findings. 23 of the 31 quilts, he told her, are authenticatable as mid to late 19th century American folk textiles of significant quality. Of those 23, 14 show sufficient stylistic and technical consistency to suggest the work of a single primary maker. The remaining 8 are likely collaborative pieces from the same regional tradition. He paused. 4 of them, he said carefully, are in my professional opinion museum grade, the kind of work that serious institutional collections actively seek and rarely find intact. He gave her the formal appraisal numbers. Miriam wrote them down in her spiral notebook with the same careful hand she had used for grocery lists across 40 years. When she finished, she set the pen down, sat very still in the folding chair beside her workbench, breathed slowly until the pressure in her chest resolved itself into something she could carry. The total appraised value of the collection was $214,000. Miriam was 73 years old, living in a shed on a gravel lot at the edge of a small Missouri town, and she was sitting on a fortune that had been buried beneath her floor. She did not make any rash decisions. That was not how she was built. Instead, she spent the following weeks doing what she had always done when something important required thinking through. She worked while she thought. She kept improving the shed. Installed a proper wood stove with a flue that Raymond's assistant had helped her source. Replaced the worst of the floor planking with solid oak boards. Sanded them herself. Sealed them herself. Cut a second window into the north wall to let better light in. Her hands had become something she barely recognized. Calloused and sure. The hands of someone who constructed things rather than merely maintained them. Cecile drove out on weekends and helped. Their friendship had deepened the way friendships sometimes do when they begin in practical necessity and discover, somewhere in the middle of shared labor and honest talk, that they have quietly become something more. Cecile brought food and reference materials and her own particular brand of steady, clear-eyed encouragement that never crossed into false comfort. She was the first person Miriam told about the appraisal figures, and her response, a long silence followed by a very quiet expletive, entirely out of character, was exactly what the moment required. The story of what Miriam had uncovered could have stayed quiet, held close among the handful of people who already knew. It would have too, if not for Gloria Park. Gloria wrote a weekly column for the regional paper out of Jefferson City. She'd caught wind of the authenticated quilt collection through Dr. Anita Voss, who had mentioned the find in a university newsletter about significant folk art discoveries across Missouri. Gloria phoned Miriam in March, asked if she'd be willing to talk. Miriam sat with the question for 2 days before she agreed. The article appeared on a Thursday in April. The headline read, "quote_26, quote." It told Miriam's story plainly, without ornamentation, and that turned out to be more than enough. The eviction, the deed, the trap door, the quilts, the appraisal. Within 48 hours, 3 regional outlets picked it up. One national lifestyle publication ran a trimmed version under a different headline. One Miriam found a touch overwrought but didn't protest. The attention it generated was beyond anything she'd imagined. Her phone rang without stopping for a full week. Collectors called. Museum curators called. A documentary filmmaker called twice. And then, in the evenings, after the professional inquiries had gone quiet, other women called. Women who had walked through their own versions of what Miriam had walked through. Those were the calls she stayed on the longest. Sometimes an hour with a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger. Because they spoke a language she understood completely, every syllable of it. It was during the second week after publication that Conrad Whitley appeared on Rutter Road. Miriam was outside when his car crept up the gravel track. A newer model than the one she remembered. It moved slowly, with a visible hesitation, as though the driver wasn't sure the road was good enough for its undercarriage. She was transplanting seedlings into the raised bed she'd built along the shed's south wall. She did not stand, did not walk toward him. She waited. He stepped out of the car looking smaller than she remembered. Not physically. Still the same broad-shouldered man in the same category of expensive coat. But something had compressed in him. Something that told her the months since November had not been uncomplicated. His eyes moved across the shed, the new window, the repaired roof, the raised garden bed. The neat gravel path Miriam had laid from the road to the door. His expression shifted through several things before settling on one she couldn't immediately name. She said she did not put down her trowel. He told her he had read the article. She said nothing. He told her he hadn't realized the property held any value when the county transferred it to her. That if he had known there was anything of significance there, he would naturally have, and here he paused, recalibrating his sentence mid-construction. Miriam waited patiently for him to find a place to land. He landed on the word partnership. There was, he explained, potentially a legal question, whether a property sold by the county for back taxes might carry with it certain claims tied to items discovered within it. His understanding was that found property on a purchased lot occupied a complex area of law. He had spoken to someone, not quite a lawyer, his tone suggested, but adjacent to one, who believed there might be grounds for a conversation. Shared interest in the collection's value, a percentage, a reasonable arrangement between reasonable people. Miriam set down her trowel then, not because she needed her hands free, because she wanted to give him her full attention when she said what she was about to say. She told him the deed to the property had been transferred to her cleanly and legally by the county of Missouri. She told him she had consulted with an actual lawyer 3 weeks prior, the first thing she'd done after the article ran and the calls began. The collection was unambiguously hers. She told him the word partnership was an interesting choice from a man who had communicated with her exclusively through a mailbox slot, who had not spoken a single word to her face in the 18 years she'd paid his uncle Harold Gentry reliable rent. She told him she wished him well, and she meant it, because carrying his misfortune on her conscience was not a weight she intended to bear. But this conversation was finished. Conrad Whitley stood on Rutter Road long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable. Then he climbed back into his car and drove away. Miriam picked up her trowel, went back to her seedlings. The first quilt sold in May. A private collector in Chicago, a woman who had spent 30 years acquiring significant American folk textiles, reached out through Raymond Chew 2 weeks after the article appeared. She was precise, knowledgeable, and made no attempt to negotiate below the appraised value. Miriam had already decided she would not accept less, regardless of whatever pressure anyone applied. The collector examined the medallion quilt in person on a Tuesday afternoon. She asked 3 technical questions, sharp, specific, that made clear she understood exactly what hung before her. She wrote a check that same day. At the door of the shed, she shook Miriam's hand and said, with what seemed like genuine feeling, that this was one of the finest pieces she had acquired in a decade. Miriam deposited the check the following morning. Then she sat in her car in the bank parking lot, not moving, just letting the reality of it sink into her bones. Over the months that followed, 9 more quilts found homes. 2 went to private collectors. 1 traveled to a folk art gallery in Nashville, where it anchored a small exhibition. The gallery sent Miriam a photograph, the quilt hanging on a white wall under proper museum lighting, framed by an explanatory card that told its story. The shed, the trapdoor, the $5 deed. 3 careful paragraphs. 3 quilts were acquired by the State Historical Society of Missouri after a negotiation process Dr. Anita Voss helped Miriam navigate. The final figure landed considerably above the individual appraised values because the society understood they were purchasing not merely objects, but a documented fragment of regional cultural history. The remaining 3 sold through an estate auction house in St. Louis that Raymond had recommended, a sale that drew bidders from 6 states and sparked a brief flurry of coverage in the kind of publications that tracked such things. The 14 quilts Miriam kept. 4 were museum-grade pieces she had decided early on would never sell at any price. Not because she had calculated their maximum value and was holding out, because they belonged to whoever had made them. And since that woman was long gone, beyond any return, the closest thing to honoring her was keeping them together, intact. The other 10 she held because she was not finished deciding what to do with them, and because she had learned, at 73, that patience is not the same thing as delay. What the sales gave her, beyond the money itself, was foundation. She turned that word over in her mind often during those months because it meant exactly what she needed it to mean. Not just financial security, though it was certainly that. Something more structural, a base from which to stand upright rather than a constant desperate scramble not to fall. For the first time since Edgar had died, and honestly, for the first time in years before that, Miriam Foss was not managing scarcity. She was building something. She started with the shed, not because she had to. She could have rented an apartment now, could have moved somewhere with running water already installed, floors that did not demand her personal involvement. But the shed was hers in a way that went deeper than the deed bearing her name. It was the place that had demanded her full self at the exact moment she had almost forgotten she possessed one. Walking away from it would have betrayed everything the previous months had taught her. She hired Dwayne, a local contractor who had done solid work for a neighbor Cecile knew. For 3 months, she worked alongside him, learning what she could, delegating what she could not. Together they converted the structure into something still recognizably itself. The metal bones remained, the corrugated roof, the basic geometry of a working building. But now it was insulated, plumbed, wired, genuinely livable. She kept the original workbench. She kept the trap door. She'd fitted it with proper hinges and a new ring pole, and now it covered the root cellar she had scrubbed clean and lined with sturdy shelving. 14 quilts resting there, the ones she was keeping. The oak floor she had laid by hand during those long winter months, she refinished it herself. It came up warm and solid beneath the natural light pouring through both windows. Her mother's kitchen table went against the east wall, under the north window. By September, Miriam had a home. Not the home she had lost, something different, something that carried her fingerprints in the most literal sense possible. She had built it with her own hands, and that fact still startled her when she sat with it long enough to let it sink in. She had been a woman who paid rent and tended a garden, a woman who trusted that stability came from continuity, from simply staying put. Now she understood something else entirely. Stability could be constructed. It did not have to be inherited or granted or preserved from some earlier chapter. You could make it from nothing, even at 73, even from a $5 shed on a gravel lot at the end of a road nobody bothered to drive down. Her children visited in October. Nathan flew in from Tulsa and stood in the doorway of the converted shed. He looked around slowly. His expression shifted, from disbelief to something that was clearly pride, though it took him a moment to find that feeling inside himself. Sylvia sat at the kitchen table and cried quietly, then laughed at herself for crying. And Miriam made coffee, and the three of them sat together in the afternoon light and talked the way they hadn't talked in years, honestly, without the careful distance that had built up between them since Edgar died, without that particular awkwardness, a mother who was supposed to need her children, and children who weren't sure how to give what was needed. Nathan said, "Mom, I should have come sooner." Miriam said, "You're here now." Then Cecile arrived with a bottle of wine and a pan of cornbread. The four of them sat around the table Edgar had hauled home from a neighbor's garage sale 20 years back. The table that had survived the eviction and the move and the winter on Rutter Road. They ate. They talked until the light outside was gone and Missouri stars crowded the sky. Miriam looked around at all of it. The quilts hanging on the wall, the oak floor beneath her feet, the window she had cut with her own hands, the people she loved, the people she had found, and she felt something she finally recognized as joy. Not relief, not survival, joy. That distinction mattered enormously. 2 years after Miriam Foss signed a transfer deed for $5 and drove east on Rutter Road with everything she owned crammed into a car and a borrowed minivan, she stood before a room full of women at the Clover Falls Community Center. She did not entirely recognize the life she was describing as her own. Not because it felt foreign, because it felt more genuinely hers than anything she had lived before it. The community center event had been Cecile's idea. She organized it under a modest banner, a gathering for women over 60 in the region who were navigating transitions. Divorce, widowhood, displacement, the particular invisibility that seemed to descend on women past a certain age, like a weather system nobody had warned them about. 43 women came. Some drove more than an hour. They sat in folding chairs with coffee cups in their hands and the careful expressions of people hoping to hear something true. Miriam told them the truth. She told them about the eviction notice in the mailbox. The 4 apartments that weren't possible. The conversation with Pete Salazar at the county assessor's office, less than 5 minutes long, and it changed everything. She told them about the padlock key and the smell of old paper, the trap door, the 31 bundles wrapped in muslin cloth that had waited underground longer than she had been alive. She told them about the appraisal figures and the article and Conrad Whitley standing on that gravel track. She told them about building a floor and cutting a window and learning at 73 that her hands were capable of things she had never once asked them to do. She told them about the woman who had made the quilts, because in the month since the discovery, Miriam had chased that question with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything else. Working with Dr. Anita Voss and a local historian, had gone back through the county archives, pulling property records one by one, tracing the chain of ownership link by link. And what they uncovered was this. The shed and the lot on Rutter Road had belonged, in the 1870s and 1880s, to a woman named Beulah Crane, a freed woman. She had settled in central Missouri after the Civil War, farmed her quarter-acre, and made quilts of such quality that the historical record showed they were known and admired throughout her community. She died in 1891. No direct heirs. The property drifted from owner to owner across the decades, and not a single one of them had any idea what lay beneath that floor. Beulah Crane had stored her life's work underground, wrapped with care in muslin, fully intending to come back for it. She never came back, but the work waited. 130